The wind cut sharp enough to sting as I leaned into the barn door, its hinges groaning in protest. I'd only meant to see how bad the damage was before deciding if the building could be saved. Instead, my eyes caught a shape in the far corner that didn't belong too smooth, too still for hay. Then it shifted, and the light from a gap in the siding fell across a child's face. She was wrapped in a torn blanket, cheeks chapped from the cold. Behind her, a woman rose slowly, knife in hand, eyes fixed on mine. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever found yourself in a moment where one choice could change the rest of your days. My name's Caleb Vance, and by the winter of 1882, I had no use for town's neighbors or talk. I'd fought in the war as a younger man, and when it was done, I tried to build a life in Missouri. It lasted long enough to marry, long enough to hold my baby girl in my arms. And then a fever took them both within the same week. After that, the fields felt like graveyards, and the house was just wood and nails. Folks say a man either finds something worth living for or a place to hide. I chose the second. The Arizona Territory had room for men like me. A little money bought a lot of worn-out land, the sort nobody else wanted. My place sat 3 miles off the road into Dry Fork, a leaning shack, a barn with half its roof sagged in, and sagebrush thick enough to catch the wheels of a wagon. It was quiet country. In summer, the dust hung in the air until sundown, and in winter, the ruts froze solid before the sun had a chance to soften them. I liked that. It kept strangers away. I'd been raised to keep what was mine in order and to give help when it was rightly asked for. My father believed a man's worth was measured by his word, and my mother kept the Sabbath with the same care she kept her bread dough always ready when needed, never wasted. On the frontier, that meant mending your own fences, sharing water with a neighbor in drought, and minding your own affairs the rest of the time. I carried those lessons with me, though I had no one left to pass them to. In Dry Fork, the contrast between my world and the one in town was sharp. The merchants talked of the railroad pushing west of land changing hands for prices no homesteader could dream of. Speculators came in on the stage wearing polished boots and carrying ledgers, looking at the land like it was just numbers on a page. I kept to myself, bought only what I needed and paid in cash, so no one had cause to remember me. That February afternoon, I'd set out to look over the barn for the first time since signing the papers. From the outside, it was just a silhouette against the hills, warped siding roofline slouched like an old mule's back. I wasn't expecting company. But when I stepped inside, the air was colder than it was out in the wind, smelling of mold and old straw. My boots scraped over the packed dirt, and the shadows in the far corner didn't look right. That's when I saw her, the little one, and the woman standing over her. I didn't reach for the revolver at my hip, though the habit was there. We just stood, the cold air between us, holding still as glass. Somewhere outside, the wind rattled the loose boards, but neither of us moved. I could tell they'd been here a while, and that whatever they were running from was worse than anything in this barn. The woman's knife stayed steady in her hand, the blade dull but gripped as if it were the only thing between her and the rest of the world. Her eyes never left mine, sharp and watchful, even when I eased down to one knee. The child shifted under her blanket, no sound but the faint rustle of hay. I reached into my coat, pulled out the last of my morning bread, and set it on the dirt a few feet from them. She didn't move to take it, not yet, but her gaze followed when I stepped back toward the door. Outside, the wind met me with a hard push, carrying the smell of frozen sage. I pulled my collar high and walked toward the shack, each bootstep sinking into the crusted ground. Inside, the air was warmer, the stove holding on to what heat it could. I leaned my rifle near the door and sat on the edge of the cot, listening to the faint rattle of the barn boards in the distance. That little girl's face stayed in my mind, her eyes too big and too still for her age, reminding me of a look I'd seen before. The next day, I carried a small sack to the barn. I didn't try to speak, just left it by the door, boiled beans, half a loaf, and a strip of dried venison. By the next morning, the sack was gone, and the empty tin bowl sat rinsed and dry on the trough. I took that as a sign and brought more the following evening. The same exchange happened again. Food left, cleaned bowl, returned. No words, just a quiet rhythm forming between us. On the fourth morning, I stepped inside with another bundle. This time the child was sitting up, her hair-tangled cheeks showing a touch of color. She held a wooden spoon in her small hand and looked at me without blinking. Her mother appeared from behind the hay, quick as ever, lifting the girl into her arms. She didn't speak, but I saw the way the little one leaned over her shoulder, still watching me as I set the bundle down and walked away. That evening I stayed longer by the fire in the cabin, sorting through my food stores and counting what I could spare. I thought about the wagon, about whether the general store in Dry Fork would start asking questions if I began buying for more than one person. It would need to be done carefully, the same way I'd handled most things since I came here. The next morning, instead of leaving food at the door, I knocked. The barn stayed quiet for a moment before the door opened, just a crack. Her face was pale from the cold, and her eyes searched mine. I held out a tin mug. "Coffee," I said. "Boiled clean." She took it without a word and motioned toward a bench inside. The air in the barn was warmer now, a fire pot burning low against the wall. A small pot of beans simmered nearby, and Ayani, though I didn't yet know her name, sat wrapped in blankets playing with a piece of string. I sat on the bench, leaving space between us. She poured some coffee into a smaller cup and handed it back. We drank in silence for a time before I asked, "You got anybody looking for you?" She hesitated, eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "My people," she said quietly. "Scattered?" She didn't offer more, and I didn't press. I reached into my coat and placed a folded linen shirt beside her. "It's big but dry," I told her. Her fingers paused on the stitching. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. Then she looked at me. "Your name, Caleb," I answered. She gave a small nod. "Nidita." It was the first time we'd spoken each other's names. I nodded toward the child. "She feeling better?" Nidita's eyes softened as she looked at her daughter. "No more fever." The days that followed brought longer stays in the barn. I brought flour beans and strips of cloth she could use for patching. In return, she kept the place tidy, the fire going, and Ayani clothes. By the end of the second week, I had cleared out the old workbench and repaired a bench near the hearth. We didn't talk much, but she no longer stiffened when I entered, and Ayani began to follow my movements with curious eyes. One morning, as I handed over a bag of flour, Nidita's fingers brushed my arm. It was only for a moment, but it stayed with me through the rest of the day. That afternoon, she came to the cabin for the first time. I was hauling water from the well when I saw her near the fence line, Ayani bundled against her shoulder. "You need something?" I asked. She shook her head, then added, "You said coffee." I held the door for her. Inside the cabin was plain one room, a cot, a stove, and a small table, but it was warm. She stayed near the door at first, adjusting Ayani's shawl and letting the heat touch their faces. I poured 2 mugs, and this time she sat at the table. "Better than water," she said after a sip. Ayani curled into her lap, drifting toward sleep. I set another log in the stove and said, "Someone came by last week. Said he was looking for runaways." She froze, her arms tightening around her daughter. "I told him I hadn't seen anyone," I added. She looked at me, then steady and certain. "Thank you." I shook my head. "Wasn't for you, was for her." "For both," she said simply. That evening, I brought her a pair of small boots I'd bought in town, plain but sturdy. She turned them over in her hands without speaking, then met my eyes with something I hadn't seen before: trust. From that day on, she came to the cabin more often, helping with meals cooking over the stove while Ayani played nearby. It was a quiet shift, but one I noticed. By mid-March, the snow had stopped, leaving a crust over the ground that crunched underfoot. One morning, I heard a soft humming near the barn. I stepped around the corner and saw Nidita kneeling by the trough, showing Ayani how to press wildflower stems into a strip of cloth. She glanced up, saw me, and held up the cloth. "Spring," she said. I asked if she needed anything, and she thought for a moment before saying, "Bucket." I brought one, and when I returned, Ayani was asleep in the sun. Nidita stood wiping her hands. "I clean inside," she said, motioning toward the barn. "You bring hammer." We spent the afternoon fixing a loose board near the stall gate. She asked questions about the nails, the grain of the wood, why the wall needed bracing from the bottom instead of the side. I answered in short words, and she listened closely. When I handed her a strip of leather to fasten a beam, she tied it tight without hesitation. By the time we finished, Ayani had woken and toddled to the doorway, blinking against the light. Nidita scooped her up and dusted her off. I leaned on the stall gate and asked, "You ever fix fence line?" She nodded. "Once with my uncle." I hesitated, then said, "Could use help." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw her answer without words. That evening, she came to the cabin again, stepping fully inside without waiting. She hung her shawl on the peg next to my coat and moved around the room like she'd been there before. Ayani settled on a folded blanket in the corner, and the smell of stew filled the air. The quiet between us felt different now. Not just shared space, but something starting to take root. The light outside had turned to amber when she spoke. "You never ask about my husband?" I looked at her. "You have one?" She shook her head. "Promised once. He died before the raids." She didn't add more, and I didn't push. The fire snapped low, and Ayani stirred in her sleep, murmuring a single word. "Papa." Nidita's eyes met mine across the table. Neither of us spoke, but the words stayed in the air like a bridge between us. The morning after Ayani called me Papa, nothing was spoken about it. Still, the hours between us felt different. The guarded pauses in our days were easing, replaced by a steady knowing. Nidita no longer kept herself to the barn. When I returned from town, she would be waiting near the porch with Ayani on her hip, watching the trail as if it was the most natural thing in the world. That week, I set about fixing the broken axle on the wagon. The general store clerk had given me a curious look when I bought extra sugar and fabric. The sort of things a man living alone didn't usually need. I kept my answers short, paid in cash, and left without inviting conversation. Out here, fewer words meant fewer questions. Back at the homestead, I found Nidita boiling water over the stove, scraping dried venison into the pot. She didn't startle when I came through the door. Instead, she handed me a clean towel before I even asked, and Ayani sat on the floor nearby, making crooked little dolls from scraps of cloth. The cabin had begun to feel lived in the corners, filled with signs of more than one life. As I dried my hands, I asked, "You thinking about staying in the cabin?" Her eyes lifted from the pot. "You want me out?" "I didn't say that," I replied. She studied me a long moment, then said I stayed close to the barn before. "Easier to run if I need." I met her gaze. "You still thinking about running?" "Not anymore," she said, and there was no hesitation in it. That evening, after Ayani was asleep, I took down an old tin box from the shelf. Inside was my late wife's comb, a broken locket, and a small blanket that had once been at the foot of my daughter's crib. I sat by the fire with it in my hands. Nidita noticed, but didn't ask. She knelt beside the stove, brushing ashes from the rim, and when I handed her a cup of coffee, our hands met and stayed a moment longer than needed. She broke the quiet first. "You don't ask me what happened before?" I kept my voice low. Only if you want to tell it. Her jaw tightened, then eased. She stared into the fire. They tied my cousin to a post. Shot him while we watched. My uncle died the same day. Ayani was born after. We ran. Men followed. One tried to take me. I stabbed him. Don't know if he lived. My fists tightened on my knees and she noticed. You angry? She asked. I'm angry they made you run, I said. She looked at me differently, then the sharpness in her eyes giving way to something bare. You still think of your wife? Yes, I said. You loved her, I did. Still do. But that don't mean I stopped living. She nodded slowly. I never had a husband, only promises. They all died. The fire cracked low. Ayani murmured in her sleep, and Nadita turned toward the sound, before facing me again. Would you want someone? Now I reached out, not in haste, but with care. My hand touched her cheek, my thumb brushing her skin. I already do, I said. She didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed me. It was soft, a quiet meeting of breath and warmth. When we parted, her hand stayed on my chest a moment longer. I'm not afraid here, she whispered. You don't need to be, I told her. She nodded. Then I'll stay if you ask me. I'm asking, I said. That night, she didn't return to the barn. She stayed in the cabin, Ayani's small cot drawn close to the bed. I woke before dawn to find Nadita beside me, her hand resting over mine. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel like it had been built for grief. The next morning, pale gold light came through the slats, touching her face where she lay sleeping. I stepped outside to find the land damp with thaw, the old oak near the barn just starting to bud. Nadita joined me in the doorway, the shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose from sleep. We stood side by side looking toward the hills. You sleep all right? I asked. She nodded. Better than I have in years. We spent the day working together. She helped skin the rabbit I'd trapped her hands quick and practiced. I patched a section of fence along the southern edge of the property, and when I split my hand on a nail, she was there with a strip of cloth binding it tight and shaking her head at me without a word. Later we sat on the floor, Ayani in her lap, while I mended an old shirt one-handed. My other hand rested on her knee, not deliberate, but she didn't move away. I was wondering, I said finally, if you'd want to bring your things inside for good. Not just visit. Stay. She looked at me cautious, but calm. You sure I am? I already asked once. I'll ask again if I have to. She reached for my hand, her fingers light over the back of it. I'll stay, she said, but not as a guest. You're not, I told her. That evening, she told me more about her mother and the ways she'd been taught before the raids, how to grind corn with a stone, how to find certain roots in dry country. I told her about my father's farm in Missouri and carrying my daughter through the chicken yard to make her laugh. We didn't speak to fill the air. Some silences felt whole on their own. After Ayani was asleep, Nadita stood at the window. If they come again, bounty men, I'll fight. I won't run. I stepped behind her, my hand steady on her shoulder. You promise, she asked. Anyone comes here meaning harm won't get far, I said. She turned and I kissed her this time, certain. That night, she folded her few things into my drawers, set Ayani's cot closer to the bed, and hung her shawl beside my coat. The wind shifted direction before morning, bringing the scent of pine instead of ash. I knew changes in the air, and I felt one settling in our lives. A few days later, as we worked side by side in the yard, I saw movement on the horizon, a lone rider, dark against the pale sky, coming straight along the trail toward us. Rudd's visit stayed with me longer than I cared to admit. Even after his horse disappeared past the ridge, I kept the rifle close, cleaning it each evening, checking the rounds twice. The barn door got a second latch, and I cut a firing hole in the east wall where it faced the open stretch. Each morning before sunrise, I walked the ridgeline, eyes on the horizon. I didn't speak much about it, but Nidita noticed. She kept Ayani inside, more teaching her words in my language, tracing letters in the dust by the stove. One afternoon, I worked at the fence while the sun sat low. The air smelled of thawing pine, heavy and damp. Ayani played near the porch with a tin spoon dragging lines in the dirt. Nidita was chopping carrots on the cabin step when she spotted me watching the ridge. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, "but not without trouble." On the fifth morning, I saw a dust plume far off. 3 riders this time, their shapes growing clearer as they closed the distance. I didn't wait for them to reach the yard. Slinging the rifle across my chest, I met them at the trail. Rudd was at the front, his long coat catching the wind. The other 2 had the look of men used to carrying iron. One with a scar across his cheek, the other riding a bay gelding that looked half-starved but fast. "We're riding through Rudd called Voice Even. Got a warrant for a man in Red Rock, but figured we'd check your memory again." His eyes scanned the barn in the distance. "I haven't seen anyone," I said. "That answer hasn't changed." The man with the scar smiled thinly. "You're real protective of that old building." "It's mine," I said. "Place like that could hide a lot." "I don't hide what's mine," I told them. "I protect it." Rudd leaned forward in the saddle. "You sure you want this kind of trouble, Vance?" I kept my stance, Bamman. "I've seen trouble, lived through worse. If you're set on making more, I won't be the one bleeding first." There was a long pause. The wind lifted the edge of Rudd's coat, and his gaze stayed on me as if weighing something. Finally, he shifted back in his seat. "We got nothing legal. Just rumors." "Then ride on," I said. They turned without another word, the sound of their horses fading into the hills. I stayed there until they were no more than shadows against the sky. When I returned, Nidita was standing outside, her hand still on the knife she'd used to cut vegetables. "They're gone," I told her. She nodded, but her fingers trembled slightly as she set the knife down. I covered her hand with mine. "You don't need to be afraid anymore," I said. "We're not running." She looked at me for a long moment. "You sure I am?" That evening, we buried the old saddle blanket Ayani had first slept in under the cottonwood behind the cabin. Not because it was worn through, but to mark the change. Nidita tied a strand of her own hair to a twig and pressed it into the soil. "For remembering," she whispered. Ayani helped pat the dirt down her small hands, careful. 3 days later, I asked Nidita to marry me. There was no speech, no ceremony, just me standing in the doorway while she mended my shirt. "I'd like to give you my name if you want it," I said. She looked up steady and sure. I would take it and keep it. We spoke our promises under the open sky that weekend, just the 3 of us. Ayani clapped when we kissed. By summer, the barn stood straight again, its roof mended and doors even. The garden sprouted rows of beans and squash, and Ayani had taken to calling me Papa in the daylight, without hesitation. No one came looking again. Even so, I kept watch. One evening, the sun dropping low, I caught sight of a lone figure on the ridge, too far to make out, but standing still as a fence post. I stepped to the porch, hand resting on the rifle. The figure didn't move, didn't wave. When I looked again a minute later, the ridge was empty. I kept thinking about that figure I'd seen on the ridge, still as stone and watching from a distance. It wasn't the way neighbors came to call. I checked the rifle again that night, made sure the doors were barred before we slept. The next morning, the ridge was empty, but I still made the walk before sunrise, scanning the line where sky met earth. By midday, the air had a heavy stillness to it, the kind that comes before something breaks. Nidita noticed my eyes on the hills, and asked no questions, only kept Ayani close to the porch while she worked. That evening, after the sun slid behind the far mesa, hoofbeats carried on the cooling air. Not the steady lope of a rider passing through, but a slow, measured pace coming straight down our trail. I stepped out onto the porch as the shape came into view, one man mounted on a gray coat and hat dusted from the road. He reined up a few yards from the steps. "Evening," he said, voice low. "Name's Rudd. Thought I'd ride by." I recognized him at once, though he carried himself different this time, less sure, more deliberate. He asked again if I'd seen an Apache woman and child. My answer stayed the same. No one had passed through. He studied me a long while, eyes narrowing slightly. "Some folks think you might be keeping to yourself for a reason." "I do," I told him, "and that reason's mine." His gaze shifted past me toward the cabin door. I moved enough to block his view. The air between us tightened, but neither of us raised our voice. Finally, he tipped his hat and turned the gray. "If you see anything, you let someone know." "I won't," I said. He didn't look back, and I didn't move until he'd cleared the rise. When I stepped inside, Nidita was standing just beyond the doorframe. Ayani's small hand clutched in hers. "He saw?" she asked. "No," I said. He guessed. "That's different. The next days, we stayed to a quieter rhythm. I split wood and kept the stock watered. Nidita worked in the garden, showing Ayani how to press seeds into the dirt. Still, the air felt taut, like a rope drawn too tight. I knew Rudd hadn't come out just for talk. On the fourth morning, I caught sight of dust again. 3 riders this time, Rudd among them. They didn't slow as they reached the trail. I met them halfway, rifle in plain view. The man to Rudd's left, lean with a scar under his eye, nodded toward the barn. "Fine place to hide a thing or two." "It's mine," I said, "and it stays shut." Rudd's gaze was steady. "You're willing to risk a fight over it, if it comes to that?" I told him I'll still be standing when the dust settles. The scarred man smirked, but didn't dismount. After a long pause, Rudd shifted in the saddle. "We've got no paper for you, Vance. Just keeping our eyes open." "Then keep them moving," I said. They turned back toward the ridge dust curling around their horses' legs. I stayed where I was until they were just specks against the sky. Back at the cabin, Nidita was chopping kindling, her jaw set. "They'll come again," she said. "Then we'll be ready," I answered. That night, we moved Ayani's cot closer to the bed. I set the rifle within arm's reach. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of rain from the south. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called, and its echo rolled over the hills. The days after that second meeting with Rudd moved slow, but the watchfulness never left. Each morning, I still walked the ridge, scanning for dust or movement. The weather had turned warmer, the kind that tempted you to believe spring was settled in for good, but I knew better than to trust a calm sky. One afternoon, while I was tightening the south fence line, Nidita came out with Ayani on her hip. She held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Bread," she said, handing it over. "For when you finish." Ayani reached for my hat brim, giggling when I tipped it toward her. Moments like that had grown more common, not forced, just part of the day. Toward evening, we sat on the porch. The air smelled faintly of mesquite, and the sun dropped behind the hills in a slow wash of red. Nidita rested her hands in her lap, eyes following Ayani as she played in the dirt near the steps. "You think they're done coming?" she asked. "I think men like that keep riding until they're made to stop," I said. She nodded, quiet, but I saw the set of her jaw. 2 days later, I was in town for supplies. The general store was busier than usual, with a freight wagon unloading barrels at the side door. I kept my purchases small flour, salt, coffee. But as I stepped out, I caught sight of Rudd across the street speaking with the blacksmith. He didn't approach, just tipped his hat once in my direction. I gave a short nod and walked on. When I reached home, Nidita was tending the garden rose, Ayani beside her, with a small tin pail. I told her I'd seen Rudd, nothing more. She didn't pause in her work, only said, "Then he knows where to find us if he means to." That evening, as we cleared the table, I said, "If it comes to it, I want you and Ayani in the root cellar." She set down the plate she was holding. "If it comes to it," she answered, "I'll be where you are." There was no tremor in her voice. The next morning brought a light rain. I spent the first hours mending harness leather in the barn, while Nidita and Ayani shelled beans in the cabin. The quiet was good until the sound of hoofbeats came from the south trail. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on a rag. A lone rider this time, moving at a steady walk. He drew up short of the porch. "Name's Rudd," he said, as if I might have forgotten. "Just thought I'd let you know some bounty men from further west passed through Dry Fork asking after a woman and child." I told them nothing. I studied his face, looking for the catch, but found none. "Why tell me?" I asked. "Figure you'd want the warning," he said. "They might come this way." I gave a single nod. "Then I'll be ready." He turned his horse and left without more talk. I watched until he was a dark shape against the pale sky. When I went back inside, Nidita was standing by the window. "What did he want?" she asked. "To warn us," I said. She was silent for a moment, then replied, "Then we make ready." We spent the rest of the day preparing. The root cellar was stocked with jars and water. The rifle and extra ammunition were set in easy reach. Nidita cleaned her knife and kept it close. Ayani, sensing the change, stayed near whichever of us was in the room. By nightfall, the air had cooled and the rain smell lingered. We ate in quiet, the lamplight throwing long shadows against the walls. I listened to the faint drip from the eaves and thought about how close the trail ran to the house. Somewhere in the dark, a branch cracked, and all three of us looked toward the door. The sound outside the cabin held for a long moment before fading. Whatever had stepped on that branch was gone or waiting further out. I set my hand on the rifle and kept it near through the rest of the night. Morning broke calm, the air cool and clear. I walked the ridge again, eyes sweeping the stretch of land where trail met horizon. No riders, no dust. Just the wind moving through the grass and the steady creak of the fence in the south lot. For the next week, we lived in a quiet readiness. The root cellar stayed stocked. The rifle remained close at hand. Nidita kept Ayani near her side, though the child still found ways to laugh, dragging her tin spoon through the dirt to make winding paths. Every day without trouble felt like we'd gained something worth holding. Then one evening Rudd came again, this time alone, his horse at an easy walk. He dismounted at the porch and tipped his hat. "They're not coming," he said. "Word is they turned west." I looked at him for a beat, weighing the truth in his eyes, then nodded once. "Appreciate you telling me." He didn't linger, just swung back into the saddle and rode toward the open plain. When I stepped inside, Nidita was standing by the table. "It's over," I told her. She searched my face. "For now." "For good," I said, and I believed it. She let out a breath she'd been holding for too many months and went to lift Ayani into her arms. The child's head settled on her shoulder, content and safe. That night, the lamplight was soft on the cabin walls. We ate without the weight of listening for hoofbeats, without glancing toward the door. After Ayani fell asleep, Nidita laid her hand over mine. "We don't run anymore," she said. I met her gaze. "No, we don't." Spring came on quick after that. The garden took root. The barn stood solid against the wind. Ayani followed me on short legs. When I did chores, her questions small but steady. And each evening, the three of us sat on the porch, watching the sun go down over a piece of land that now belonged to more than just me. I'd come here to disappear. Instead, I'd found a reason to be seen again, not in town, not by the men who passed through, but here in the eyes that met mine across a table, in the small hand that reached for me without fear. Life on the frontier teaches you that survival isn't just about holding ground. It's about knowing when to open the door, when to stand your place, and when to call something or someone your own. If you've ever stood your ground for someone who needed you or found a family in a place you never expected, I'd like to hear your story.